I'm gonna show you how to capture the absolute best quality video that this Mini 4 Pro possibly can capture using these cinematic settings. So let's go right into the menu here, and the first thing we have to do is click out of auto mode, and this is gonna unlock all of this sweet nectar settings that we need. Now we're gonna click first into here and set the white balance. Now, if you're not familiar with white balance, you can actually leave this one in auto. It's fine. The white balance on this camera is pretty good. If you do know everything about white balance, you know you're gonna wanna take that out of auto. Whatever light source temperature is, you're gonna wanna set your white balance to that. So most of the time you're filming outdoors. Generally 5,000 is kind of your midday range, and then as the sun gets warmer towards sunset, you're gonna be changing from about 55 to 5,600. I'm usually at like 5,200 when I'm shooting outside, so we'll go ahead and leave it at that. And for resolution, this camera's sweet at 4K, so we're gonna pop it into 4K. And frame rate can either be 30 frames per second or 24 frames per second. And this is for regular speed. This isn't for slow-mo. This is just gonna be for regular speed video. I'm gonna go ahead and just pop it in 30 frames per second because that's what I like it as. And we're gonna switch it over to D-Log-M, which is gonna capture the absolute most information color-wise and bitrate depth-wise that this camera possibly can. We're gonna go ahead and go into the camera settings now. And we're gonna take ISO out of auto. We're gonna set that at 100. We're gonna take shutter out of auto because we actually are gonna want shutter speed to be double our frame rate. And at this ratio, this is called the 180-degree rule of motion. And this is where the camera is gonna illustrate motion the same exact way we perceive motion in real life. So you can tell we perceive motion obviously by it being blurred. The faster it moves, the more it blurs. That's how we perceive it. That's how our brains process it. Now in a camera, if your shutter speed's double frame rate, it'll portray it the same exact way to your audience or viewers. Now if it's not, oftentimes when you're shooting outside, the shutter speed's gonna be way too high. And what happens is when your shutter speed's high, you don't capture any blur motion. It's all just very, very rigid and sharp. No blurring at all. And actually what happens is when somebody's watching your content, it looks jarring because it's not what they're used to perceiving motion to be. So this is why we want shutter speed at double frame rate. So our frame rate was at 30 frames per second. So we're gonna go ahead and pop shutter speed to 1/60th. Now if it's at 24 frames per second, shutter speed is gonna be at 148. All right, so we've got our settings all dialed in at this point. So super easy. Now the only thing we're gonna have to do is exposure compensate, because once I set shutter speed at double frame rate, my exposure is gonna be thrown off a little bit because this is letting in a lot more light than this camera is used to. So if we're shooting outside, we're gonna need neutral density filters in order to cut the amount of light coming in so we achieve a proper exposure. To find the strength of neutral density that you're gonna need, what you do is you put the drone with no filter on in the ambient light setting that you're gonna be shooting in. So I'm gonna go ahead and put this one outside, and you can see here, it's way overexposed. This is not gonna be usable in any regard. So what I wanna do is I wanna move my shutter speed over until I find where the EV is balanced, where it's at 0, and right here it's at 1/1000. So I know, because I know stops of light measurements, this is gonna need 4 stops of light reduction, which is an ND16 filter. Now, if you don't know how to measure stops of light, which I don't blame you, it's pretty confusing and took me a while to master, there's an app called the Polar Pro Flare app, and you go right into it and you go into the long exposure setting. Now, you're not taking long exposure, but we're gonna hack this little feature on the app and show you how to use it. So we're gonna go into the long exposure setting and move our shutter speed to 1/1000th, which is the native reading that this thing's reading. And we're gonna move the filter added until we see the shutter speed desired, which is 1/60th. So if I go over to 4 stops, I see 1/60th. So like I said, we needed 4 stops of ND in order to balance this exposure. Well, and now to confuse you even more, so we don't even include an ND16 in this pack, and I'm gonna show you why. Because this camera is totally fine with the ISO at 100, 200, or sometimes even 400. Above 400, it's gonna get pretty noisy, and we don't want that grain and noise introduced into our footage. We want a nice, clean image. So, since we don't have an ND16, this means I'm putting on the next strength up, which is an ND32, and I'm just gonna move my ISO from 100 to 200 and boom, exposure compensated, looks perfect. Now another thing you can actually do, I don't recommend it, but it makes life a lot easier, especially if you're not comfortable with these manual settings, is you can put ISO in auto mode. And what that's gonna do is it's basically gonna exposure correct between 1 and 2.5 stops and every little lighting adjustment in between. So you don't have to edit for that in post as if you were just locking off ISO. It's gonna kind of bounce through that range. But what that means is if you come inside or the sun starts going down and you had a dark ND32 filter on there and it's in auto mode, it's gonna throw ISO all the way up into that 1600 range and your footage is gonna look like shit. So we want to make sure your ISO is between 100, 200, maybe 400. So just keep that in mind if you've got ISO on 100. Yeah, it might be exposure balanced on your screen, but it's gonna be very, very noisy and pretty much impossible to grade. So with those settings in your Mini 4 Pro, you're gonna be capturing buttery sweet nectar every time you go out and shoot, as long, of course, as you have the Polar Pro ND filters to help compensate for exposure at shooting at those cinematic shutter speeds. If you have any questions at all, drop them in the comments below. Happy to answer them. We'll see you on the next one.